Chapter 2 of Men of Iron. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Men of Iron by Howard Pyle. Chapter 2. From the time the family escaped from Falworth Castle that midwinter night to the time Miles was 16 years old, he knew nothing of the great world beyond Crosbey Dale. A fair was held twice in a twelvemonth at the market town of Wisby, and 3 times in the 7 years old Dickon Bowman took the lad to see the sights at that place. Beyond these 3 glimpses of the outer world, he lived almost as secluded a life as one of the neighbouring monks of St. Mary's Priory. Crosbey Holt, their new home, was different enough from Falworth or Easterbridge Castle, the former baronial seats of Lord Falworth. It was a long, low, straw-thatched farmhouse, once, when the church lands were divided into 2 holdings, one of the bailiffs' houses. All around were fruitful farms of the priory, tilled by well-to-do tenant-holders, and rich with fields of waving grain, and meadow-lands where sheep and cattle grazed in flocks and herds, for in those days the church lands were under church rule, and were governed by church laws, and there, when war and famine and waste and sloth blighted the outside world, harvests flourished and were gathered, and sheep were sheared, and cows were milked, in peace and quietness. The Priory of St. Mary's owed much, if not all of the church prosperity, to the blind Lord Falworth, and now he was paying it back with a haven of refuge from the ruin that his former patron had brought upon himself by giving shelter to Sir John Dale. I fancy that most boys do not love the grinding of school life, the lessons to be conned, the close application during study hours. It is not often pleasant to brisk, lively lads to be so cooped up. I wonder what the boys of to-day would have thought of Miles's training. With him, that training was not only of the mind, but of the body as well, and for 7 years it was almost unremitting. "Thou hast thine own way to make in the world, sirrah," his father said more than once when the boy complained of the grinding hardness of his life, and to make one's way in those days meant 1,000 times more than it does now. It meant not only a heart to feel and a brain to think, but a hand quick and strong to strike in battle, and a body tough to endure the wounds and blows in return. And so it was that Miles's body as well as his mind had to be trained to meet the needs of the dark age in which he lived. Every morning, winter or summer, rain or shine, he tramped away 6 long miles to the Priory School, and in the evenings his mother taught him French. Miles, being prejudiced in the school of thought of his day, rebelled not a little at that last branch of his studies. "Why must I learn that vile tongue?" said he. "Call it not vile," said the blind old lord grimly. "Belike, when thou art grown a man, thou'lt have to find thy fortune in France land, for England is haply no place for such as be of Falworth blood." And in after years, true to his father's prediction, the "vile tongue" served him well. As for his physical training, that pretty well filled up the hours between his morning studies at the monastery and his evening studies at home. Then it was that old Dickon Bowman took him in hand, than whom none could be better fitted to shape his young body to strength and his hands to skill in arms. The old Bowman had served with Lord Falworth's father under the Black Prince both in France and Spain, and in long years of war had gained a practical knowledge of arms that few could surpass. Besides the use of the broadsword, the short sword, the quarterstaff, and the cudgel, he taught Miles to shoot so skilfully with the longbow and the crossbow that not a lad in the countryside was his match at the village butts. Attack and defence with the lance, and throwing the knife and dagger, were also part of his training. Then, in addition to this more regular part of his physical training, Miles was taught in another branch not so often included in the military education of the day, the art of wrestling. It happened that a fellow lived in Crosbey village, by name Ralph the Smith, who was the greatest wrestler in the countryside, and had worn the champion belt for 3 years. Every Sunday afternoon in fair weather he came to teach Miles the art, and being wonderfully adept in bodily feats, he soon grew so quick and active and firm-footed that he could cast any lad under 20 years of age living within a range of 5 miles. "It is main ungentle armscraft that he learneth," said Lord Falworth one day to Prior Edward. "Saving only the broadsword, the dagger, and the lance, there is but little that a gentleman of his strain may use. Natheless, he gaineth quickness and suppleness, and if he hath true blood in his veins, he will acquire knightly arts shrewdly quick when the time cometh to learn them." But hard and grinding as Myles's life was, it was not entirely without pleasures. There were many boys living in Crosbey Dale and the village, yeomen's and farmers' sons to be sure, but nevertheless lads of his own age, and that after all is the main requirement for friendship in boyhood's world. Then there was the river to bathe in, there were the hills and valleys to roam over, and the wold and woodland with their wealth of nuts and birds' nests and what not of boyhood's treasures. Once he gained a triumph that for many a day was very sweet under the tongue of his memory. As was said before, he had been 3 times to the market town at fair time, and upon the last of these occasions he had fought a bout of quarterstaff with a young fellow of 20, and had been the conqueror. He was then only a little over 14 years old. Old Diccon, who had gone with him to the fair, had met some cronies of his own, with whom he had sat gossiping in the ale-booth, leaving Myles for the nonce to shift for himself. By and by the old man had noticed a crowd gathered at one part of the fair ground, and snuffing a fight, had gone running, ale-pot in hand. Then peering over the shoulders of the crowd, he had seen his young master, stripped to the waist, fighting like a gladiator, with a fellow a head taller than himself. Diccon was about to force his way through the crowd and drag them asunder, but a second look had showed his practised eye that Myles was not only holding his own, but was in the way of winning the victory. So he had stood with the others, looking on, withholding himself from any interference and whatever upbraiding might be necessary until the fight had been brought to a triumphant close. Lord Falworth never heard directly of the redoubtable affair, but old Diccon was not so silent with the common folk of Crosbey Dale, and so no doubt the father had some inkling of what had happened. It was shortly after this notable event that Myles was formally initiated into squirehood. His father and mother, as was the custom, stood sponsors for him. By them, each bearing a lighted taper, he was escorted to the altar. It was at St. Mary's Priory, and Prior Edward blessed the sword and girded it to the lad's side. No one was present but the 4, and when the good prior had given the benediction and had signed the cross upon his forehead, Myles's mother stooped and kissed his brow just where the priest's finger had drawn the holy sign. Her eyes brimmed bright with tears as she did so. Poor lady! Perhaps she only then and for the first time realized how big her fledgling was growing for his nest. Henceforth Myles had the right to wear a sword. Myles had ended his 15th year. He was a bonny lad, with brown face, curling hair, a square strong chin, and a pair of merry laughing blue eyes. His shoulders were broad, his chest was thick of girth, his muscles and thews were as tough as oak. The day upon which he was 16 years old, as he came whistling home from the monastery school, he was met by Diccon Bowman. "Master Myles," said the old man, with a snuffle in his voice, "Master Myles, thy father would see thee in his chamber, and bade me send thee to him as soon as thou didst come home. Oh, Master Myles, I fear me that belike thou art going to leave home to-morrow day." Myles stopped short. "To leave home!" he cried. "Ay," said old Diccon, "belike thou goest to some grand castle to live there, and be a page there, and what not, and then, haply, a gentleman at arms in some great lord's pay." "What coil is this about castles and lords and gentlemen at arms?" said Myles. "What talkest thou of, Diccon? Art thou jesting?" "Nay," said Diccon, "I am not jesting, but go to thy father, and thou wilt presently know all. Only this I do say, that it is like thou leavest us till-morrow day." And so it was as Diccon had said. Myles was to leave home the very next morning. He found his father and mother and Prior Edward together, waiting for his coming. "We 3 have been talking it over this morning," said his father, "and so think, each one, that the time hath come for thee to quit this poor home of ours. An thou stay here 10 years longer, thou'lt be no more fit to go than thou. To-morrow I will give thee a letter to my kinsman, the Earl of Mackworth. He has thriven in these days, and I have fallen away. But time was, he and I were true sworn companions, and plighted together in friendship never to be sundered. Methinks, as I remember him, he will abide by his plighted troth, and will give thee his aid to rise in the world. So, as I said, to-morrow morning thou shalt set forth with Diccon Bowman, and shall go to Castle Devlen, and there deliver this letter, which prayeth him to give thee a place in his household. Thou mayest have this afternoon to thyself to make ready such things as thou shalt take with thee, and bid me Diccon to take the grey horse to the village and have it shod." Prior Edward had been standing looking out of the window. As Lord Falworth ended, he turned. "And, Myles," he said, "thou wilt need some money, So I will give thee as a loan 40 shillings, which some day thou mayst return to me as thou wilt. For this know, Myles, a man cannot do in the world without money. Thy father hath it ready for thee in the chest, and will give it to thee to-morrow, ere thou goest." Lord Falworth had the grim strength of manhood's hard sense to upbear him in sending his son into the world, but the poor lady mother had nothing of that to uphold her. No doubt it was as hard then as it is now for the mother to see the nestling thrust from the nest to shift for itself. What tears were shed, what words of love were spoken to the only man-child, none but the mother and the son ever knew. The next morning Myles and the old bowman rode away, and no doubt to the boy himself the dark shadows of leave-taking were lost in the golden light of hope as he rode out into the great world to seek his fortune. End of Chapter 2.